Welcome everyone to this final episode in the series we call the Reactive Church. Sometimes the church acts to change the world, and sometimes the world acts and the church reacts. Over these last few weeks, we've gone through a number of incidents in history which the church did not cause, but the church was changed by it. And today, our final episode is one I rather poetically call to see the unseeable and hear the unhearable. And we might say, seeking to know the unknowable. Take the poetry all the way. I'm speaking today basically about the final, most modern aspect of the Reactive Church, and that's the church's reaction to modern science. It's been both a positive and a negative reaction, as we'll see. But I think we first start out by trying to understand that science is not really necessarily a purely modern thing. I mean, every culture and every time has had people who were curious and insightful and gathered wisdom, and they might well be in their time have been seen as scientists. The ancient Greeks and Romans, we have their writings. We know that they were investigating things, inventing things, trying to heal things. But they're not really what we think of as modern science. And there's a little distinction that needs to be made there. When we talk about modern science, I think we're talking about that which has developed possibly since the Reformation and has been influenced by a change in the thinking from inductive learning to deductive learning. I'll talk a little bit more about that, about Newtonian scientific method, about how we have an idea now that something is actual evidential truth for science if it can be performed repeatedly with all the same factors and you get all the same results. Given the same factors, the results will be the same. This allows people to check on what other scientists are saying, to do the experiments themselves and say, yes, that worked. Yes, it is. That must be something universal. If different scientists get different results, then we say, well, that's not yet there. It's something yet to go. But I want to acknowledge science is not a new thing. The ancient medieval church had their own sorts of scientists, and sometimes we now call them astrologers or alchemists. And we acknowledge that what they were doing might be very interesting, it might be insightful, but we don't necessarily think of it as science now. It's partly a problem that we've discussed before, a problem between how we think and how we talk. And how we think and talk will be influenced by how we understand ourselves. And the two great Western influencers are Plato and Aristotle. Or if you're German, I think it's Platon and Aristoteles. But I'm going to use the English, Plato and Aristotle. They actually lived at the same time. And yet they thought in two divergent ways, both of which have been hugely influential. The medieval and the early church was purely based on the philosophy of Plato. The whole sacramental system is based on Plato, where truth is known to be that which is closest to God. The heavenly things are the true things. Earth is but a flawed reflection of the heavenly truths. Aristotle chose a different way to look at the world. He said, to know truth, you open your eyes and you observe things. If you want to know, is this a flower? You open your eyes and look, does it have those things which are attributes of flowers? Plato would say, if it's a flower, if it reflects the flowers in heaven. So they're very different. Plato's looking up to God for truth. Aristotle is looking down at the details in the earth for truth. One would be divinity-oriented, one sort of creation-oriented. There is, of course, possibility to combine the two. But the early church didn't have to worry about combining the two, because through some, I don't know, library fire or some earthquake that damaged, the Western church had no copies of any writings of Aristotle. And so it wasn't until the 12th century that the Western church finally received a copy. And thanks to Ellen, who helped me get the name, we were talking about the Muslim jurist named Averroes. That's the Latinized form. I actually found his Muslim name, which I found very interesting. Abu il-Wa'id Muhammad bin Ahmed bin Rushd. He was the one we now in Western church call Averroes. He lived in Andalusia in the south of Spain, and he had access to Muslim libraries where, strangely enough, there were still manuscripts of Aristotle. He was able to translate them, and they were found by Western Christian scholars, notably Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas and Baruch Spinoza, both of whom were deeply influenced by the competing philosophy of Aristotle. And thinking like Aristotle, seekers of truth began to look at creation, look at the details of the world to discover things. And this is the foundation upon which modern Western science is based. Plato still has a place in the church. It's still beautiful philosophy, and we don't want to discount it altogether. But when we're talking about science, we're talking about seeking truth in the details through earthly observation. This is 12th century when they discover Aristotle again. By the 14th century, we have now the realization in the West that if we want to know ancient truths, we got to find those ancient documents. And there is the Renaissance, where they turn back to classical literature, and they're learning from it, no longer limited simply to the truths that the doctrinal Platonists of the church had been teaching them. It's maybe identified mostly in the iconic person of Galileo, who, of course, following sort of an Aristotelian thinking, was observing everything, including observing the stars in their motion and observing the world and the light and the length of days, and came to the conclusion that the sun was the center and not the earth. Well, this was a moment of huge reaction from the church. The church, so based in Platonic thought, found this very threatening. If the earth is not the center, then everything needed to be rethought. And the church was so confident that they had it all right. The arrogance of the church actually got to the point where Galileo was forced to recant his scientific understandings or be burned as a heretic. Fortunately for us and for science, Galileo recanted officially. The letters he wrote to his daughter indicate that he might have done so with his fingers crossed. He just realized that it was better to live and to keep studying and to keep observing and to keep writing. He couldn't publish, he couldn't lecture, but he was not burned as a heretic. The Catholics thought they'd won. They thought that the Platonistic foundations were going to be solid and secure and no one would dare. But unfortunately, Galileo and his scientific exploration and the spread of Aristotelian thinking came at a time of the convergence of resurgent classicalism and Protestant Reformation. The Catholics no longer had the ability from Rome to simply silence all opposition. And so there were many Northern Europeans who were absolutely free to explore, to do science, to discover and observe. And so it is, as we continue with this, we're going to see that most of the scientific discoveries that we'll talk about today are done by Dutch, English, and Germans, who were not silenced or threatened with heresy by the confraternity of doctrine of the faith in Rome. Galileo is the first we've talked about. He became so famous because there was a third convergence happening, and that was the technological advances. We talked a little bit last week with the Industrial Revolution, but this is actually pre-Industrial Revolution. It's the technological abilities of glass and grinding glass and making magnifying glasses, making spectacles. And it didn't take much to realize that if you put two of them together, the glass had certain properties. Once Western civilization could make pure glass again, as they had in the Roman days, they were able to start utilizing it for observation of the world. It's given credit to a Dutchman named Zacharias Janssen in the 16th century, who was able to put the two lenses together, put them together and realize that there would be enlargement possibilities. And then, of course, Antony van Leeuwenhoek put them together and was able to make workable microscopes so that the world could be observed more closely. And Robert Hooke in 1666 is the first one to use this new tool and actually discover living organisms in the microscopic view. A whole new field of biology, botany, and scrutiny of God's creation came. We were actually now able to see things we could never have seen before. The same thing happens with the telescopes. Hans Lippershey, a Dutchman in 1608, is said to have made the first, but Galileo improved upon it very quickly. And by 1611, there was the famous German astronomer Kepler, who also had made vast improvements. In 1668, within 60 years of its invention, Newton had already gotten to the point where he invented the reflective telescope. So you could have massive, big reflective lenses without having to try to hold them up to your eye. The church's reaction, again, was very negative, at least in the South, in the Catholic parts, very, very negative. They ridiculed, they demeaned, they outlawed, and they suppressed. In the northern, more Protestant countries, there wasn't necessarily a negative reaction, but there wasn't necessarily a positive reaction either. It was more of a neutral thing. I think they figured that if those kind of machines could help us produce better product, make more money, make lives better, they could be tools sent from God for us to use. The scientific development through the 18th century was huge, as oftentimes sort of rich gentlemen hobbyists would keep observing and find things. Collections of rocks developed into the study of geology. Collections of diseases and bones and biological samples produced more modern medicine and the ability to categorize different animal life. The negative reaction from the Northern Church really was minor until in the 19th century, the famous trip of the HMS Beagle around the world. This was the ship on which Charles Darwin traveled around, and with his observational skills, he was able to keep a log and record of all the animal and plant life. Theoretically, I think he was there on board trying to find plants that they could bring back that would produce good harvests, or find minerals that might be producing gold or silver. It was trying to figure out where in the world could be things that the modern people could exploit. But along the way, he kept the log, and of course, at the Galapagos Islands had the Great Awakening. Now, he finished that trip in the 1830s, and in 1839, he published a book, the journal of his voyage on the HMS Beagle. But it was 20 years before he actually published on the origin of species. He had it all written and he kept it in a safe, afraid to bring it out because he knew the world would explode and they would all blame him. And he was only later, when another scientist started talking about evolutionary theory, that Darwin realized he needed to be published if he was ever going to get credit for it. 1859, it's published. And he was right. The world exploded. Because what the implications were of his version of science is that the Bible isn't telling the truth. This is what the church feared. And the negative reaction to Darwin, along with geology showing bones of animals 1 million years old, when the world, according to the Bible, was only 6,000 years old, this presented lots and lots of problems. Either they had to realize that the Bible may not be intended to be read as a science book, or they had to say science was contrary to faith in God. They didn't really see a lot of good options. In the USA, Canada, the Protestants got together and they said, we must fight the evil of Darwinism. And they started having pro-Bible conferences. And the one that was most influential was called the Niagara Bible Conference. It was on the border between Canada and the US, where Niagara Falls are. And they met in other places, but more than often they met at Niagara. And so that was the title was given. They met from the 1870s through to the beginning of the 20th century. And each year they would bring together the best of the Protestant theologians, all of whom would assert biblical inerrancy. The Bible cannot be false. If the Bible has anything in it that isn't absolutely true, then how can we believe in God? This was their dilemma. Everything in the Bible had to be true, which included the creation story and the 7 days. Talk of 1 million years or 100 million years. Talk about all these dinosaurs and things. This really shook the foundations of their Protestant faith. They developed from 1910 to 1915 a series of pamphlets they published on biblical inerrancy, on Bible translation, on how to read truth, how to understand things, and how asking questions was rebellious against God. It was a development that they called the 14 pamphlets they published, they called them the fundaments of faith. The foundation, fundament. It's nice that that word is so similar to the German. The fundaments became what fundamentalists believed. And the word fundamentalist was coined in the 1920s to apply to those people who could not accept the science could be as true as the Bible, or that the Bible was presenting a truth in some way other than science. The fundamentalists just stood first. They chose the same dogmatic approach that the Catholics had been doing all along. Truth is in the scripture, period. And anything that disagrees with scripture, well, you must have misunderstood it. It must be false. When presented with the evidence of the dinosaurs, they had an easy solution. Well, those are the animals killed in the flood. In Noah's flood, they didn't get in the ark, so they all drowned, and that's why they're buried under the ground. Trying to get a brontosaurus into a Noah's ark would have been, or two of them, to speak, would have been quite a balancing act. No, the acceptance of scientific truth as reflecting the same truth as biblical truth was so problematic that it didn't really get much play until in the 1940s and 50s, a French Jesuit theologian whose name you might or might not recognize, he actually started talking because he had been a scientist and he respected scientists, but he was also a Jesuit. He respected dogma. He respected the sacraments and the church. His name, Teilhard de Chardin. And 1881 to 1955, he died the same year I was born. But his theology was of a mystical sort, so that the dogmatic theologians had a very hard time. They knew he was heretical, but they couldn't figure out just how. The very conservative Catholics did not like that he was writing poetry and calling it theology. He was talking about the mystery of God rather than the God we know because St. Athanasius, a creed that told us everything we needed to know. In 1962, this great and important theologian, Teilhard de Chardin, was actually condemned by the same confraternity of the doctrine of faith that had condemned Galileo. Though he was a best-selling author, and he's now influenced several generations of Catholic thinkers, and he seems to be quite well respected by Pope Francis now. So maybe being condemned is not such a bad thing. But Chardin gives us the answer to the problem, and that's that we do not need to see the Bible through the small, limited lens of fundamentalism. That we have the ability, as we know more about creation, to expand our understanding of God. As we've discovered genetics, it gives us a great insight into how it is that humanity is the product of God's work. As we understand astronomy and we can see the vastness of the universe, does that lessen God's creative ability, or does it expand geometrically, algorithmically? You know, God is, we've always said infinite, but now we're coming to sort of confront infinitude with new eyes. The Hubble telescope and telescopes they promised to put on the surface of the moon, and thus far being able to see farther than we could ever imagine. Does that challenge our faith in God, or does it just make us realize how great God really is? God is not a little God who walks in the garden with Adam and Eve, and that's all there is to it. God is infinity. God is unknowable. God is inscrutable. And it makes that so much more beautiful, our faith in him. Of course, there are still many scientific taboos that the church has yet to figure out how to deal with. I mean, reproduction is one. I think it's just because the church doesn't ever want to talk about sexuality, period. You know, the reproduction, is that a woman's issue in a male-dominated church like the Catholics? Are they going to be able to ever come to grips with serious discussion on those topics? And then it spills over into other more abstract scientific knowledge like cloning, cloning Dolly the sheep, cloning organs for reproduction. You think you have liver disease? If they take a healthy part of your liver and clone you a whole new liver, is that God's will? Is that God's miracle? Does all healing have to be simply through the power of prayer, or can the Holy Spirit use machines and medicines and tablets and, well, gene splicing, hybridizing, changing the nature of a life force, in vitro fertilization, transitioning from one gender to another? All of these things, the church still, there are people on both sides of the issue, both arguing and condemning each other. I personally find these issues to be unthreatening, but very interesting because of what it says about God and about our desire to make sure that everything we do honors God. You know, I know that those who are of a conservative sort, they think they are honoring God by their faithfulness to their principles. But science also is honoring God by revealing new truths unimagined, as we see things that were always unseeable, as we can hear things that were always unhearable, as we can talk on Zoom over computers, putting waves through the air so that I can speak to you wherever you are in the world. This unimaginable advance in technology, does it limit our understanding of God or threaten God in any way? Or does it give us the power to preach the gospel far and wide like we've never had before? I think modern science will continue to change our understanding of the world. And maybe the most powerful change is that we have to recognize that evolution change, constantly altering circumstances, this may well be part of what it means to be God. We went through the first 2,000 years of Christian faith thinking God is that one thing that never changes, always dependable, always predictable, solid as a rock, eternal in that it cannot be moved. But maybe what's eternal about God is the constantly evolving glory that God is, that it's not etched in stone, set on a pillar. It's growing and living, expanding. So worthy of our worship, so worthy of our observation, investigation. I don't think science will ever be able to say what God is, but they are very good now, revealing us God's handwork, giving us ever more reasons to have faith. And it's given us an opportunity to look at the Bible as a document of faith and hope rather than a document of science, history, and moral dogmatism.